room for a very good reason. This whole room was dedicated to the Battle of Lachish. If you look on the map here, Lachish is just southwest of Jerusalem. Sennacherib, the son of Sargon II, built the great city of Nineveh. And from Nineveh, he comes and does what his father did not do. He decides to attack the tribe of Judah. And so he comes with his armies down from Nineveh, and he attacks all the fortified cities of Judah. The only two cities that are remaining are Lachish, which you see pictured here today. That's what it looks like today. It's just a mound in the desert. That's what artists would have thought it looked like back in the days that it was being attacked. And we're talking about 704 to 681. So we're talking about the beginning of the 7th century BC. This whole room has been dedicated to that battle. And what they would do is if you would start from the left here and work your way down to the right, you would see the battle being ensued. Over here, you can see some of the walls of Lachish. And here they are attacking the walls. And here you can see some of the Israelites being impaled on stakes alive. And then finally the battle is finally won. And then the elders of the city come and they give allegiance to Sennacherib sitting on his throne there on the right. So you follow the whole story on these pictographs. And this is how they would then tell their stories. On these murals, they're in Nineveh. So when the British came, found this room, they've now replaced them. They replaced the murals to make it look like the original room. What we're interested, however, is it's missing. There should be a prison sitting right here. They temporarily removed it, but nonetheless, don't worry. That was just a copy. The original is upstairs, and we'll see the original. Because when the British came to Nineveh, and when they came into the palace of Nineveh, they found a prison, and they call it the Tailor's prison, because the man who found it was named Tailor, gave his name to it. That's upstairs. On one side of the prison, it's an 8-sided prison, on one of the panels, it mentions, there you see a picture right here. On one of the panels, it mentions 7 things that we find exactly paralleled in 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 19 and Isaiah chapter 37, verse 9. When you look at the panel, when you look and see what it talks about, it mentions about the battle of Lachish. It also mentions that Hezekiah rebelled against Sennacherib, proving that Hezekiah is historical. He's mentioned by name there on the prison, corroborating what we see in 2 Kings chapter 19. Also in Isaiah 37. It mentions also that Lachish fell, also that Hezekiah was shut up in Jerusalem. It mentions that Hezekiah paid 30 talents of gold in homage to Sennacherib. It did not work. But that corroborates what we see in 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37. And then it mentions that they come to Jerusalem to attack Jerusalem, but they suddenly go home. It doesn't say why they suddenly go home. Why do you think they had to suddenly go home back to Nineveh? Any of you have any idea? They had a problem? Where? Back home. There's another battle going on where? In Nineveh. Nineveh was being attacked. But who was attacking Nineveh? The Bible is the only place that mentions who was attacking Nineveh. And if you read in 2 Kings 19, it says that there's a man named Tahaka, or Tidhaka, depending on where you put the vowelization. It's a consonantal text. It says a man named Tidhaka or Tahaka was attacking Nineveh. He had to rush home to protect his own city. Now, there is no reference to Tahaka or Tidhaka in any archaic annals. There's no reference to him in any historical writings. Herodotus does not mention. Thucydides doesn't mention. Nobody knows who the Tahaka is except the Bible. And so many historians have believed that this is nothing more than fiction. Nothing more than legend. Typical of most historians, when they don't like something, they say it's fiction. You'd like to know who this Tahaka is. It must be someone pretty significant if Sennacherib is going to rush all the way back those hundreds of miles home to protect his city. It has to be someone large, someone big, yet nobody's ever heard this name. That is until the British Museum has discovered it. They have now discovered him. You want to know who he is? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to let the British Museum tell you. I'm going to let you hold on a minute, okay? You're going to have to hold your horses, because you're going to get excited when you find out who this guy is. But only the British Museum has found him in the last century. We've known about him for 2,800 years. And it's the British Museum that has now finally discovered what many historians believe is nothing more than legend and myth. He's no longer legend, but hold on a minute. Let's wait and let's stop. Let's come back to Sennacherib, because he then comes back to Jerusalem a second time. After he takes care of this mysterious king named Tahaka, he returns a second time, and to pick up that battle, let's go around the corner here. 200,000 men. He'd already destroyed all the other cities. Why could he not destroy Jerusalem? What went wrong? I think it's put a hook in his nose. Is that a... Okay, there's something else happened. We're going to see it upstairs. The Babylonian Chronicles tells us that when he returns home to Nineveh, his two sons rise up and they kill him. Now the Bible also says that as well. But that's fascinating that an extra biblical account refers to his two sons rising up and killing. Why would you kill a conquering king? Why would you kill a king who's at the height of his power, as we now know, because what we're going to see in just about 10 minutes? Unless something terrible happened in Jerusalem. What do you think happened in Jerusalem? Who knows? 2 Kings chapter 19. Absolutely. There's the answer. In 2 Kings 19, what happened? Yeah. Absolutely right. The angel of the Lord came down and killed 185,000 of his men overnight. Now put yourself in Sennacherib's place. He's come all the 100 miles, quite a few hundred miles down to Jerusalem. He sets up his tent, goes to sleep that night. He's been traveling all day, sleeps right through the night, wakes up the next morning, stretches, washes his face, opens up some temple flaps of his tent, and what does he see? 185,000 of his men decimated on the ground. He heard no battle, he heard no screams of pain, there was no clanking of swords, there's no enemy soldiers, there's no blood anywhere. All he says are these 185,000 of his soldiers lay dead on the ground. What would you do in his place?
Run.
You'd go home. What would happen when you get home? And then relatives of the 185,000 then want to know what happened. What do you think you're going to do? How are you going to explain what has happened to their men? You've got a problem, don't you? Yeah. Can you now understand why his two sons rose up and killed him? But why does it not say that down here? Why is there nothing here? For one very good reason. Do they ever talk about defeat? Is there any reference to any defeat in any of these artifacts? Kings don't talk about defeat, just like politicians don't talk about defeat. You don't find any politician ever admitting that maybe he should not have gone to war. Now, for that reason, you can see there is a problem here. So what are we going to do? If you're a historian, this is all you have to go on, right?
Wrong.
As a historian, you're not going to accept anything but what you read here. And you're not going to come back to the Bible, because if you come back to the Bible, which tells you the rest of the story, and tells you what actually went on, you're going to have to accept two premises. First and foremost, you're going to have to accept that there's a God. And secondly, you're going to have to accept that God enters time and space and impacts on human history. They were not able to read the hieroglyphics until the Rosetta Stone was discovered, which unlocked the hieroglyphic alphabet. Once they did that, they realized what they were reading, and as you can see, this is the Taharka that everybody's looking for, that nobody could find. There he is. That's the first image, or the first known image we have of this Taharka that's referred to in 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37. Now, who is he? Well, it turns out that he is one of the great kings of the Cushite kingdom. The Cushites owned all the land from what is present-day Somalia all the way over to Senegal. That whole land, basically north of Sahara, that whole land was under their jurisdiction. So they were the great other superpower of the day. No wonder then when Taharka, hearing that Sennacherib had left Nineveh, he went with his army to attack Nineveh, assuming he wouldn't be there. That's why he had to suddenly go home to basically protect his city against this other superpower. Why is it Herodotus and no one else knew about him? Who knows? But the Bible does. The Bible is unique. It's the only piece of archaic literature that refers to him by name. Now, what's most important, and what I think is really exciting, is a number of years ago they came across the Cushite death pits, which are down underground. And when they look at these pyramids underground, an article came out back in the 1990s saying it's fascinating to see that if you look at all these pyramids, the greatest pyramid is that belongs to this man named Taharka. But then something happened during his reign that started the decline of the Cushites. But we don't know what that is. And I'm raising my hand. I said, I know what it is. If you just read the Bible, if you just read 2 Kings chapter 19, if you just read Isaiah chapter 37, you'll find the answer. It's right there. It was Sennacherib that destroyed Taharka and started the decline of the Cushites. And it's right there in our Bible. All the murals found on the palace there in Nineveh by the British from the palace itself, you notice that they're darkened. Why do you think they're darkened? Fire damage. That's exactly right. When you look at the books of NAHUM, when you look at the prophet NAHUM, he prophesies that Nineveh is going to be destroyed by fire and by water. They're looking at the fire damage here. So here's the physical evidence of the fire damage that came to Nineveh. When we get upstairs, we'll see the Babylonian Chronicles. And in the Babylonian Chronicles, it mentions that the Babylonians come to Nineveh, and it's in 615. And in 615, they come and they fire the city, and then they open up the gates to the Kosa River, and then they drown out the palace itself, which is completely fulfills what Nahum had said earlier in chapter 1, 2, and 3. So here's the fire damage of Nahum's prophecy. Upstairs, we're going to see the documentary evidence to support the flood damage that he refers to. Jericho is an exciting city because it's probably the one city that has been lived in the longest, and that's why many archaeological teams have gone back to Jericho to dig down and to find artifacts. And there was a German expedition in 1905 that went down. They came down to the 1400-year period, and they noticed that the walls had been destroyed, but that the bricks of the walls were on the outside of the city. And they said, this is a curiosity. Why would they be on the outside? If you're battering the walls with a battering ram, the walls would fall inwards. They didn't understand why the walls would be outside. Well, we know why the walls were outside. It had nothing to do with battering rams. The same character downstairs who destroyed the 185,000 men downstairs, the angel Lord, did the same thing upstairs here with the walls of Jericho. This is called the Taylor Prism, 691 BC. This is the original of what we were supposed to see downstairs. Now, there is a little confusion because some people say, yes, but they're both original. So, who knows? Nonetheless, this is the prism that refers to Sennacherib having to go home to Nineveh to repulse something that's happening back there, but it doesn't say why he had to go home. But it corroborates 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah chapter 37. It also refers to Hezekiah by name, proving that Hezekiah is historical. And refers to the fact that though he went back, they didn't give the name of who was attacking. That only the Bible gives. On the back at the very bottom is one of the Babylonian Chronicles. Now there's thousands of these Babylonian Chronicles that are owned by the British Museum. They're all down in the basement or they're in other buildings. About 17 buildings around the city where they have artifacts, big warehouses. The Babylonian Chronicles, remember, is where we found out about Sennacherib returning home after this failure that happened in Jerusalem, and his two sons killed him, which also corroborates what the biblical account says. It also refers to 615, when the Babylonians come to Nineveh and destroy Nineveh with fire and water by opening up the Kosa River, the gates of the Kosa River, and drowning out the city, supporting what Nahum prophesied. That's also from the Babylonian Chronicles. But something more recent has happened that I find is rather exciting. In 2007, in the summer of 2007, the Babylonian Chronicles are written in cuneiform. The script is cuneiform, but the language is Ugaritic. There aren't many people that know and can read Ugaritic. Actually, you can study it here at the School of Warrington African Studies. They do teach it here in London. But there are very few people in the world that read it, for obvious reasons. What's the purpose? It's a dead language. No, people don't read or write in Ugaritic anymore. But this one scholar from Germany came here in the summer of 2007, and he wanted to look at some of these Babylonian chronicles. He can read Ugaritic, and so they opened up the drawer. He took out one tablet. After about 15 minutes, he turned around and said, "Had anybody read this before?" He said, "No, why?" He said that this refers to the eunuch of Nebuchadnezzar who came, and it is referred to in Jeremiah chapter 39. The first time we have found any corroboration for this eunuch, who is the great general of Nebuchadnezzar that actually led the battles for him. He's referred to there in Jeremiah 39. There, within 15 minutes, he found corroboration for that. It was all over the papers the next day. The greatest find in the last 100 years, and I'm scratching my head there and saying, well, there's thousands of more you can read. Why don't you read all of them? And I said, we need people to start learning Ugaritic. You can learn it right here. If any of you guys want to learn it, go and start reading those tablets. I just want you to look at this tablet here. Now, this is the tablet of the flood account that is almost parallel to what we're going to see next, which is the Gilgamesh epic of the flood account. The reason I'm going to show you this tablet is because most people believe that that's the original account from which the book of Genesis got its story from, proving that the Bible had to be written after the 6th century because the Gilgamesh epic is from the 6th century. Here's the exact same story, but look at the dates. This has just been newly found. 1635 BC. That puts it 1,000 years earlier. Can you see the problem? Hold on to that. It's called the Atrahasis tablet. And the story is about Atrahasis, who very much like the Gilgamesh epic, goes in a boat, is able to not only escape the flood, but he has animals with him. So it's very similar to the flood account that we have in the Bible. Very much more simplistic, but nonetheless, I just want you to look at the date, 1635. That'll be significant when we look at what we're going to look at the next week. We're on page 11. We're down to number 18. We're looking at the flood and the creation accounts, and this is what's caused a lot of the problems for many of the biblical scholars when they were discovered by the British, they mention the very same stories that we find in the book of Genesis. And since the Masoretic text is so much more recent, the belief that has been, and still is today, that these are the origins for these accounts. Well, ironically, the flood account is not unique. They have now found over 200 separate flood accounts in almost 200 different cultures. Almost every culture has a flood account. They're not always universal. Some of them are smaller flood accounts. Some of them are just provincial flood accounts. But they all refer to a great flood. And there are many variations on the themes, which is what you would expect when you have oral tradition, which would be the case for most of it. And I would say much of the same thing is happening here as well. When you look at these, you'll see they're very simplistic. They don't take you anywhere. They don't lead you anywhere. The story of creation, the epic of creation, basically just says there was a man and a woman, they were in a garden, they were told not to eat of a certain fruit, they ate of that fruit, they were thrown out of the garden. That doesn't take you much. There's not much there. When you look at the biblical account, you can see there's a lot more sophistication there. A lot more material that is there. You can see that there was a perfect environment. There, man was able to name the animals. There was a perfect relation between man and the animals. There was no thorns, no thistles, no childbirth pain. There was a perfect relation between man and his environment. Women and man and woman were naked. There was a perfect relation between man and woman. And most importantly, it says in Genesis 3, verse 8 and 9, that God was walking and talking in the cool of the day. He was calling out to Adam and Eve. There was a perfect relation between man and God. But then something happened. Something happened which destroyed every one of those relationships. And we know what it is. He just disobeyed God once. One sin, that's all it took. And that relationship with the animal kingdom was destroyed. That relationship between man and woman was destroyed. They had to clothe themselves. They realized their nakedness was wrong. That relationship with their environment was destroyed. Now with thorns, there were thistles, there were childbirth pains. Now man had to work the ground to get his food. But most importantly, that relationship between man and God was destroyed. Man was thrown out of God's presence. Daniel was living in the 6th century, 539 BC is when the book of Daniel has been, 539 is when Babylon was destroyed. Daniel was there. So he's there in the 6th century, but he's writing about things that are very accurately, that things are happening at the time of the Greeks, which don't appear to the 3rd century, and the Romans, who don't appear to the 2nd century. So how could Daniel, writing in the 6th century, have known things that are going to have to happen 300 to 400 years in advance? Unless, of course, this is divine knowledge. But, of course, historians don't like that. They don't like anything to do with God because they don't believe God exists to begin with. So they do not like the book of Daniel. And what they've been doing, they've been trying to look in the book of Daniel to find any error, any historical error, and they found it. They found it. Because who was the last king of the Babylonians? Who was the king when Babylonia was destroyed? By, not Nebuchadnezzar.
Belshazzar.
According to the Bible, it's Belshazzar, isn't it? The book of Daniel is very clear that Belshazzar was the king. Remember, he had the writing on the wall. He couldn't interpret it. He brought Daniel up to interpret it. He reads it, and then he turns to Daniel. And Daniel chapter 5, don't worry, it's not up there. He turns in Daniel chapter 5, and he says, because of what you have done, we're now on page, you're on page 12. He says, because of what you have done, you will be number 3 in my kingdom. And that's always been a curiosity. Why number 3? If Belshazzar's number 1, he'd be number 2. So already there's a mystery built into that verse, which we're going to have to try to solve. But the biggest problem is this. If you look at all these artifacts here, they're not written by Belshazzar. In fact, there's no reference to Belshazzar. We don't know who this Belshazzar is. We know that the last of all is the final king. Nabonidus is the king that was destroyed in 539 by Darius under the authority of Cyrus the Great. All the artifacts say. That's what Herodotus says. And Herodotus should know what he's talking about because he's writing in the 5th century, just 100 years later. Close to the event. Just 100 years later, I'll pretty much go with Herodotus before I'll go with someone like Daniel. Because why? Because I know Herodotus has got it right in every other area. He was there, he knew, he was reading these artifacts. We're reading these artifacts. They all write about Nabonidus. Where is Belshazzar? He's not here. Looks like he got us over a barrel. And so what the historians are saying is it looks like the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century, redacted back to the 6th century, and that's why it was able to talk about the Romans and also the Greeks, because it's writing after the fact. Proving, therefore, that the book of Daniel is not historical, the writer is wrong, they've got the wrong king. How are we going to solve that?
Daniel was number 3. There was someone ahead.
How do you know? You've got to come to this little barrel. This little drum was discovered in the ziggurat there in there. And it's a prayer by Nabonidus. No one disputes the fact that Nabonidus was the last king. We know Nabonidus was the last king. That's not a dispute. Herodotus is correct. Nabonidus is the last king. But he doesn't have all the truth. He doesn't have the whole story. To understand that, you need to come to this drum. That's the only reference we have to Belshazzar anywhere in the world. And it was just found by accident by the British, proving that Belshazzar is historical. He is not fictitious. He did live at that time. He was the son of Nabonidus. That still doesn't solve the problem. We need to do that. We need to come to this tablet right here. That is written by Nabonidus, and it says for the last 10 years, he went down to Timon in Arabia in semi-retirement, leaving the ruling of his kingdom to his son. Who his son is. We have to go to this drum to find out who his son is. His son is Belshazzar. The two of them were co-regents at that time. Now can you understand why Belshazzar says you're number 3 in my kingdom? Because he and his father were number 1 and 2. But that means nobody later would have known that, because not even Herodotus knew that. Why did Herodotus not know about Belshazzar? Something as significant as that. Just 100 years later, why did he not know that both Belshazzar and Nabonidus were co-regents, and that Belshazzar was caretaker king while his father was living down in Timon? Before he could do what? Before he could take the throne. He was on the throne, but why is it nothing's written about him? What is it that we've been looking at? All these artifacts, what do they talk about?
Victories.
Victories concerning conquests. What would have happened if Belshazzar went and conquered anything? Who do you think would have got credit for it? Nabonidus would have got credit for it. Therefore, Belshazzar would refuse to do any conquering until his father died. He was waiting for his father to die so that then he could go out and do his conquering, and then he would get sole credit for all his conquests. Until then, he hadn't written anything because he had not done anything to write about. So nothing was written down about him. So Herodotus 100 years later knew nothing about him. But the book of Daniel does. The book of Daniel is the only piece of literature that actually knows that he was a king, and also actually refers to him as king, proving that whoever wrote the book of Daniel had been living in the 6th century. Isn't that great? Showing that the book of Daniel had to be written in the 6th century, which means these are prophecies about the Greeks and the Romans. Now who's over a barrel? Good stuff, isn't it? That's why I love these artifacts, and that's why little things, something as small as that, being discovered just in the last century, corroborating, giving us support, proving now that Daniel's got it correct. We can trust it. And if we can trust that, then we can also trust Daniel chapter 7, verse 14 that you're talking about, because that's the reference that all the Jews knew, that to be able to define who the Son of Man is. And when Jesus Christ, 25 times in the New Testament, refers to himself as the Son of Man, every time every Jew knew exactly what he was talking about, because they had trusted the book of Daniel. They knew that in Daniel chapter 7:14, it says, he will come in the clouds, and he'll have dominion from everlasting to everlasting, have dominion over all tribes, nations, peoples, and tongues. Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, as you know, is where the Israelites, after Cyrus came and destroyed Babylon, he then let the Israelites return home and rebuild their cities, rebuild their temples, and also rebuild their armies. And there have been many people that have disputed that. Historians say that just doesn't make sense. That may be sounding logical, and they may want to complain all they want, but then they're going to have to answer to that cylinder right there, called the Cyrus cylinder. Because the Cyrus cylinder is Cyrus and says very much that same thing. It's got it right there in cuneiform. Whether they don't like it, whether they want to dispute that this may have happened, they're going to have to confront their own material. That's why it's so good that you have a cylinder like that, proving that Cyrus was very advanced for his age. There's no other king that did what he did, proving how confident he was as a king. He did allow the people that he conquered to return home, did allow them to rebuild their cities, to rebuild their temples, and more specifically to rebuild their armies. He was that confident, way ahead of his time. Though it may sound illogical to historians, they're going to have to argue with their own artifacts. That's why I love it, because it just corroborates what we already know. What we do know is it comes from the same palace that Esther lived in. She possibly ate out of the same dinnerware. Nobody doubts now that the book of Esther is historical. We now know because the artifacts support not only her husband, but also possibly her son. So that no longer is in question. Good stuff. They just need to look at the artifacts.